Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Elizabeth Cavell, one of the 9 constitutional attorneys here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation. This week, we've got an exciting show. FFRF's very own Andrew Seidel has written a book. It's called The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American. And it comes out on May 14th. Recently, Andrew sat down with Dan Barker and Annie Laurie Gaylor on FFRF's TV show, Free Thought Matters, to talk about the book. This aired here in Madison last week, but it won't hit TV stations nationwide until May. So we're going to share it with you today. As usual, just type your questions in the comments or email them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Andrew will join us after the Free Thought Matters replay, so get your questions ready.
Welcome to Free Thought Matters. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Annie Laurie and I are the executive directors of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We're a national state church watchdog with more than 30,000 non-religious members in North America. We'd be glad to send you a free copy of our newspaper, Free Thought Today. You can help us in our work so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail by becoming a member of FFRF at ffrf.org.
Today, our guest is Andrew Seidel, who works with us at FFRF as Director of Strategic Response. Andrew Seidel is one of FFRF's 9 constitutional attorneys, and he has a new book, his first book, called The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American. It features a foreword by author Susan Jacoby and a preface by my very own co-host, Dan Barker.
The renowned constitutional scholar Erwin Chemerinsky calls The Founding Myth a beautifully written book that explodes a frequently expressed myth that the United States was created as a Christian nation.
So congratulations, Andrew, on quite an achievement. And I understand that you started working on this book even before you joined the staff of the Freedom from Religion Foundation in 2011. So what prompted your research into this?
I did. I've been working on the book for really about 10 years by the time all will be said and done. And it was mostly prompted by ignorance. Right? Patriotism in this country has no religion, but there's been a deliberate push to make it seem that to be an American is to be a Christian. And that really started to bother me, especially with my background in constitutional law and history. The more I learned about this, the more I researched it, the more clear it became that this was a deliberate push to try to morph and twist our history into something that it is not. And I really wanted to do more than just correct the historical record. I wanted to push back against it and go on the offensive.
I love your book because it's kind of a 2-part book. You start off exploring what others have already explored, the fact that America is not a Christian nation, and you do a great job of it. But you go a step beyond that and say that it's a good thing it isn't a Christian nation because Christianity at its core is un-American. So that second part of the book, I think, really distinguishes you. You give credit to a lot of other scholarship that shows, for example, that we were founded as a secular republic. So what's wrong with Judeo-Christian history of our country?
Sure. I mean, there is this deliberate attempt to morph the history, as I just explained. And I think the thing that's most important to me is not just correcting the record, right? We've seen other people do that, as you've said, but really going on the offensive and attacking the idea that to be an American is to be a Christian. And when you look at Judeo-Christian principles that are found in the Bible, obedience, hell, the vicarious redemption through human sacrifice, and you compare those to America's founding principles, you find out that there's not just disagreement, they are in conflict. And to claim that we are founded on Judeo-Christian principles, to me, the more I looked into it, the more ridiculous the idea became. And eventually I decided, you know what, they're in such conflict that it's fair to say that Judeo-Christianity is un-American.
Well, what your book also does is specifically go into what's wrong with the Bible and contrast biblical principles with founding principles in this nation.
Absolutely.
And so that's what's so unique about it. So give us some examples.
Well, one of my favorite ones is hell. The idea of hell it's more properly a Christian principle than a Judeo-Christian principle. It really shows up more in the New Testament than in the Old Testament, this place of eternal torture and torment. And in our Constitution, right there in the Bill of Rights, we have a prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And I think that any fair reading of the Bible's accounts of hell would declare that it's cruel. What happens there is cruel and unusual. The Supreme Court actually said that being stuck in a jail cell with a 5-pack-a-day smoker was cruel and unusual punishment. And if that is, then certainly an idea like hell would be as well. So this is a fundamental Christian principle that conflicts with America's founding principle.
Well, and what about concepts of liberty?
I mean, there's tons. The whole second part of the book is called Bible v. Constitution. I made it kind of like a court case, and it goes over all the different principles that are central to the Bible and compares them to America's founding principles. Original sin, which not all Christian sects believe, but most do, conflicts directly with our presumption of innocence. The idea that the Golden Rule influenced our founding is not really necessarily that central to American history. But even then, we can say, look, the Golden Rule is not a Judeo-Christian principle. This is a universal human principle.
It predates the Bible.
Predates the Bible by thousands of years. Every society we know of has come up with it. So really, if we're saying that the American society is founded, or American Constitution or rule of law is founded on the Golden Rule, we're saying that it's founded on universal human principles, not Judeo-Christian principles.
So we know that most Christians are basically good people in their daily lives, but what you're saying is, if they took their Bible seriously, if they were true Christians, then they would be bad Americans.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, one of the strictures in the Bible is that if one of your relatives, your friends, your family member tells you to go worship another god, or even explore that, if you were to go into church, for instance, with somebody who was not a member of your family, was a friend, and they said, just come explore, see what my faith has to offer. Technically, in the Bible, you're supposed to stone that person to death. And it's a fundamental conflict with our freedom of liberty, our freedom of religion in this country. We have religious liberty, and we have it because of the Constitution, not because of the Bible.
And of course, if you contrast the Ten Commandments with the Bill of Rights, you can really see that picture, and you have a whole section about the Ten Commandments.
Absolutely.
Before we talk about that, can you tell us about the 9-commandment judge that comes up in your book?
Yes, well, this was an FFRF case that happened just before I came on board. This was a judge out of Tennessee, Judge James Taylor, who wanted to put up one of these foundation displays in his courthouse. And so it was going to have the Ten Commandments, it was going to have George Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge praying, our national motto, "In God We Trust," all these different things which supposedly show that we are a Christian nation founded on Judeo-Christian principles. And the plaque that he wanted to put up was the Ten Commandments, except he only had 9 up there. He actually left out the adultery commandment, which was interesting because he got into some trouble with sexually harassing some of his employees as a judge. He also ended up in jail because he pled guilty to stealing money from this foundation display fundraising effort that he put together. So he was actually breaking a lot of his commandments as well as trying to put them up.
And in the Ten Commandments, as you point out, they don't usually deal with human morality. In fact, in the 10th Commandment, as you illustrate, women are considered property. It's a very patriarchal, male-dominated, un-American thing that we would consider women to be slaves and cattle.
Absolutely. And it's important to point out, too, there are probably a few areas where we need to concede that Judeo-Christian principles have had some influence on America's founding laws and our government and our Constitution. But almost universally, it's a negative influence.
Like capital punishment,
exactly,
sexist rules,
slavery. Exactly, and those are some of the big ones. And we're trying to escape that influence and have been for years. So some of America's founding principles are aspirational, and we haven't fully gotten there yet. But the Bible is set in stone. The Ten Commandments are literally set in stone. And they can never escape that, whereas we can. And I think that's an important point to make. But really, that was the favorite section that I wrote, was part 3 of the book, which is looking at each one of the 10 Commandments and comparing them to America's founding principles. It was a lot of fun.
So you know that David Barton, for example, and a lot of Christian nationalists claim that there's all these quotes of the founding fathers. They were all Christians. They all wanted this to be a Christian nation. Your book counters that.
Absolutely, it does. And you can't have a discussion like this without talking about the founders and what they personally believed. But really, I think that that's largely irrelevant to the central question. Are we a Christian nation founded on Judeo-Christian principles? Because even if they were Christians, Bible-beating, Jesus rose from the dead Christians, that doesn't necessarily mean that they founded the nation on Judeo-Christian principles.
Well, they founded it on a godless and entirely secular constitution, so their religion was irrelevant.
Exactly, and that's the critical fact. So even if they are Christian, which I think you can't make that case convincingly, we know that they built a nation that was entirely secular and in which state and church were meant to be separate.
So before we go to the break, briefly, can you define what Christian nationalism is?
Sure. Christian nationalism is the idea that this nation was founded as a Christian nation, and our government was meant to favor Christianity above other beliefs. It's not accurate, and Christian nationalists put everything in terms of restoration. They're seeking to go back to this Christian nation, but really they're trying to redefine what it is to be an American.
And they're trying to turn the United States into a theocracy.
Absolutely, which we are certainly not.
Right, a very scary prospect.
It is.
So we are talking with Andrew Seidel, who's got a new book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American, hot off the press. And Andrew, when we come back, we're going to give you a lightning round.
Okay.
We're going to throw out a whole bunch of myths about our being a Christian nation and let you rebut them.
Okay, great.
Stay tuned to Free Thought Matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.
And we're back with Free Thought Matters. I'm Dan Barker with Annie Laurie Gaylor, and we are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, continuing our conversation with Andrew Seidel, a constitutional attorney here at FFRF, who's our Director of Strategic Response. And Andrew has a brand new book out called The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American. So Christian nationalism, the idea that we were founded as a Christian nation, is a concept that's been around for a long time. Should we worry about these people? Is that just an idea, or is there something that's happening right now?
It is hugely influential at this particular time. You know, most of the time I was writing the book, it was this impotent sideshow that didn't really have any political power. It was interesting for some historians and lawyers to look at, but that all changed with the 2016 election. Donald Trump won because he is a Christian nationalist appealing to Christian nationalism. The number one factor that indicated a Trump voter in the 2016 election was whether or not they believed that the United States is or should be a Christian nation. And that was a better indicator of who would vote for Trump than race, their political party, their socioeconomic status, economic anxiety, any of those things. If you thought you were a Christian nationalist, you were going to vote for Trump.
And about 81% of evangelicals and fundamentalists, in fact, did vote for Trump.
Absolutely. And it's having a huge impact policy-wise, too. I mean, we're seeing it with Betsy DeVos trying to dismantle a public school system through vouchers. We've seen it in our foreign policy with the shifting of the embassy in Israel. We see it, you name it, we're seeing it
Defunding
impacting.
Planned Parenthood because that offends religious
Absolutely. Women's rights, LGBTQ rights, everywhere this idea, Christian nationalism, is infecting our public policy.
So to those people, does MAGA mean make America godly again?
I think it really, really does. And it's not again. right? It never was. They're trying to, that's the appeal they're making. They're preaching restoration, but really it's an entire redefinition. Just like they want to redefine religious liberty as a license to discriminate, they want to redefine what it is to be an American, that to be an American is to be a Christian.
Well, founding myth is a very good title, because that is the myth that we've encountered at the Freedom from Religion Foundation the most stubborn myth that is in the way of keeping religion out of government is this idea that the United States is a Christian nation, or was founded as to be a Christian nation. And so what else is out there threatening us?
Well, I think one of the bigger things, a lot of people can take down the Christian nation argument, but the fallback argument is always, well, what I actually meant was that we're founded on Judeo-Christian principles. And that has never really been tested. And that's what I really wanted to go after in this book, because if you can disprove that, then that automatically disproves the Christian nation myth. So, and that's why I took the time to compare the 10 Commandments to the 10 Amendments, why I took the time to go through the Bible and pull out the principles there and compare them to America's founding principles, and looked all throughout our history and can say with confidence now that Judeo-Christian principles are un-American.
Because we are a proudly rebellious nation. We fought a revolutionary war defying the sovereign, the master, the king, the lord, the monarch, right?
Absolutely.
And yet these so-called Christian nationalists think we need to go back to a time when we were subservient to this Lord and Master who gave us the 10 Commandments.
Absolutely, and there's a couple chapters on the Declaration of Independence in the book, which is a very popular talking point for both sides of this issue. But I mean, it is a rebellious document, and if you are a Bible-believing Christian, Romans says that you have to obey the governments because they are ordained by God. The founders could not have rebelled if they were Bible-believing Christians.
So what do you say when people say, well, there's Thomas Jefferson mentioned God or providence in the Declaration of Independence?
So I actually walk through each of those possible mentions. Most of them actually were not in Jefferson's original draft. They were added later. The only one that he had in there was the laws of nature and of nature's God. So I spend a little bit more time on that one.
Which is more deistic than Christian.
All of them are deistic. None of them are explicitly Christian, and none of them, other than the idea of the Creator, are mentioned in the Bibles of the time. Everybody thinks that the language in the Declaration is our Creator, but it's actually their Creator, which sort of precludes a shared view. But also, if you read the Declaration, it is completely concerned with human events. When in the course of human events, it's all about this world and humanity.
And consent of the governed, which is anti-biblical.
Absolutely. There's nothing integral to it that relies on the supernatural.
Well, so that leads us to the lightning round that we want to do. We want to hit you up with a bunch of these Christian nation myths, and you can quickly debunk them.
Sure.
Can I go first?
Yes.
Sure.
So they had prayer at the Continental Congress. That shows that there was a religious intent.
Well, this was before there was a Constitution. This was before there was a First Amendment. They did it for political reasons, and the Reverend Douche, who gave the prayer,
Douche?
That's his name, Jacob Douche, actually, in the end, said, you know what, independence is wrong, and fled to England and wrote a letter to George Washington telling him to spurn independence, he should surrender, all this stuff. A terrible, terrible person to hold up as sort of a founding American is the guy who gave this prayer.
And of course, the Continental Congress came up with the Articles of Confederation, which were a great failure.
And at the Constitutional Convention,
which
as
adopted
we talk
our
about all the
Constitution.
time, they didn't have any prayers.
All right. How about In God We Trust?
In God We Trust, as you like to point out, is a Johnny-come-lately motto. It's not from the founding era, and it was actually pushed on the nation by basically 3 highly religious men, one of them a pastor who came up with the idea, and 2 highly religious government officials who were using their public office to promote their personal religion at a time of national strife during the height of the Civil War, basically 1863, and then it was officially done in 1864. So not something that reflects our founding ethos
But
at all.
in God We Trust, you're talking about when it first went on a coin
Coins,
at the end of the
correct.
Civil War, but then it didn't get back on, it gradually got on the money. And then what about its adoption as a motto?
Well, and so a lot of the things that we'll see, probably they'll come up in the lightning round, happened in the 1950s during McCarthyism, and when there was an active attempt by the ad men on Madison Avenue to sell religion to America that was successful. And Kevin Kruse points this out in his book, and it really is again, not something that's indicative of our founding principles or ethos, and it was just added on afterwards. There's a whole section in the book called Argument by Idiom, which goes over all of these.
So what about "So help me God," when the president puts his hand, so far it's always been a his, on the Bible?
So the presidential oath is laid out in the Constitution and does not include the words "So help me God." So in that very act of promising to uphold the Constitution, by adding those words, presidents are actually amending it. We know for a fact that George Washington did not say this. The common myth is that he was the one who started this tradition, so everybody else can do it. Absolutely did not happen that way. The first was probably Chester A. Arthur in 1881, but really, in the book I did some kind of new research and dated this modern trend to 1917, right on the brink of World War I.
And even there's no reference, of course, to a Bible.
Correct.
I should hasten to say.
Correct.
What about "God Bless America"?
So that dates to Watergate. The trend of adding that on to presidential addresses was Nixon's first address on the Watergate scandal from the Oval Office. And he definitely was using it to distract the country from what actually was happening. He was using religion as this great distractor, kind of as this we see happen all the time, as a cloak of morality to say, look, I'm really a good person because I'm a religious person. Don't pay attention to what I did. Pay attention to the fact that I'm talking about God.
So when you're in trouble, it's a cloak of piety that makes you seem more acceptable.
Absolutely, and it makes you seem impervious to criticism. And he did. There's more in the book about how he did a little tour to try to convince some Southern Democrats to not impeach him, and he started playing "God Bless America" on the piano at the Grand Ole Opry. All kinds of interesting stuff.
Do you mention in the book that the song "God Bless America" was written by someone who didn't believe in God, by Irving Berlin?
I failed to do that. It's just an aside, but maybe I'll have to add it on.
Well, Irving Berlin was a Jewish agnostic humanist who wrote it for a character, and not for his views, and somehow that got turned into sort of our Christian nationalist motto. But
You should include that in your foreword.
What about "One Nation Under God"?
One Nation Under God is a frustrating one. Under God obviously was not added to the pledge originally. Again, was added in the 1950s. And to me, this really is the quintessential example that kind of sums up all these other things. You're taking a really unifying sentiment. One nation, indivisible was how it originally read, right? That's we are an undivided nation, and you're injecting religion. You're dividing the indivisible with religion. They're injecting it right there, so it's one nation under God, indivisible. And to me, that sort of symbolized how all of these Johnny-come-lately mottos and idioms entered. It was during these times of civil strife when dissent was punished, often pretty harshly, where you couldn't speak out against the government using government officials using their public offices to promote their personal religion. And they were taking these unifying sentiments, e pluribus unum, and making them religious. So they were wiping out the unifying sentiments and putting in their place religion, which is probably the most divisive force in all of human history.
And it doesn't go back to the founding, obviously.
Obviously.
If we were one nation under God, as you point out, it should say it somewhere. The Constitution should say it, but instead of God, it's we the people.
Yeah, you'd think it would begin with God, but instead, we the people. They emphasized it pretty heavily, too.
So what about all these Christian nationalists who claim that the views of the founders in their writing, I've read that in the private and public writings of a lot of the founders, more than a third of the time, the quotes that they quoted were biblical quotes. Doesn't that prove something?
There is a whole study that was done by a gentleman named Lutz, and I go over the details of that study. It's been twisted and warped by Christian nationalists to prove things that it does not prove. And for instance, they like to say that the Bible was the most referenced book during the founding, which is a very, very rough reading of the way the study was done. If you actually look at the study and, for instance, focus on the Constitutional Convention, you can see that the Bible was rarely, if ever, cited. And when it was often as this commonweal of stories to draw upon, kind of the way that Lincoln did when he did his House Divided speech that was very famous. Using it to illustrate ideas because people knew the stories, rather than pointing to it as a founding document.
But the fact that Benjamin Franklin called for prayer and referenced Scripture in his call for prayer, doesn't that show that underlying all of this, the founders still wanted God?
This is a very very popular claim, and again, it's only half the truth. In his notes on the Constitutional Convention, on his own call to prayer, Franklin wrote at the bottom, "The convention, except for 3 or 4 persons, thought prayer unnecessary." They didn't have prayer.
For the day.
Yeah, they didn't have prayer. They refused.
So we've given a teaser of your new book, and people are going to have to buy it to get all of this wealth of information. But the New York Times runs a column on new books, and they ask the author at the end, give us a short minute reply on why someone should read my book. What would you say?
The idea that we're a Christian nation is very popular, but the idea that we are founded on Judeo-Christian principles has never been explored. And I think it's absolutely critical, especially now, for every American to understand this argument and understand why it is wrong. James Madison said that it's the first duty of all citizens to take alarm at the first experiment on their liberties. And Christian nationalism is not just an experiment on our liberties, it is testing them in a way that I think has not happened, at least in recent memory. And it's a duty of every American citizen, I think, to fight back against this narrative.
And Andrew, you like to say that the Freedom from Religion Foundation and our attorneys are watchers on the wall of separation.
Absolutely.
So thank you for this great contribution to keeping religion out of government.
Andrew Seidel's book is The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American. So thank you for being our guest today, and thank you for watching Free Thought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
And we're back to Ask an Atheist, and look who's here. It's Andrew Seidel, author of The Founding Myth. And now we're going to address a few questions that came in live during that replay. So I'll jump right in. Andrew, where do you get your information or your ideas for your books?
Well, this book I actually started writing even before I started working at FFRF. It was a really long process. Basically, I'd heard this argument all the time, wanted to refute it, and the more research and reading I did, the more apparent it came to me that it was a much bigger problem. And post-Trump, it's become even more clear how big a problem it is. In terms of the research and the writing, it was really interesting because there's so much bad information out there on the internet. I had to go find original sources for everything that I wanted to cite. You know, what's the famous meme floating around the internet that says Abraham Lincoln? It's got him pictured there saying you can find anything on the internet, or don't believe a picture of, you know which one I'm talking about. Anyway, I really had to find original sources for everything that I wanted to say, because this book is going to be picked apart by the other side pretty hard.
Right. So this is from Doug Roberts. He says, I'm anti-religion, but also anti-nationalism. I see them as very similar calls to irrational and emotional discriminatory ideals. Shouldn't we all strive to break down the barriers of ideology in all its forms? What do you think about nationalism itself?
I mean, I think this is a great point that Doug made. It really, and this is why I think it shows that Christian nationalism is such a threat to our nation. You have two virulent strains coming together, this extreme Christian religion and this nationalism coming together and really pushing the boundaries of this ideology in a way that we haven't seen before. So to me, it sort of illustrates the point that this is worse than most people realize.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that it's sort of these two spheres where rational criticism and discussion are just off limits in a way that really, I think, makes them pose a danger. You know, it's pretty hard to criticize religion and engage in sort of like warranted criticism of religion in the normal kind of rational way. And I think the same goes for nationalism. I mean, the ultimate, attack against anyone with political ambition is that you're somehow un-American.
And they often seem immune to facts and logic and reasoned argument, which is one of the problems. And hopefully something, I'm not hoping with this book to convince the extreme Christian nationalists. I'm hoping to convince the people in the middle of the country that this is a problem and that our side is correct.
Okay. Well, Joseph Couch has a question here. Do you address the wild view that in God we trust, under God, or legislative prayer are somehow secular. You might have touched on that in the interview with Dan and Annie Laurie, but what do you think about that? The idea that courts have adopted, sort of.
So first of all, Joe's doing some great work. He actually formed a secular caucus recently with one of the major political parties in Nebraska, I think. So way to go, Joe. But the idea that in God we trust, one nation under God, that these sort of what the courts have called ceremonial deism are no longer religious is nonsense. We actually saw this at the Supreme Court in February, where the government defending a 40-foot tall Christian cross said, look, this cross is really not that religious. It's got a secular purpose behind it. It's a nonsense argument, and it's done to the courts with a wink and a nod. I wrote extensively about this in the book, but you can also, if you want to preview, you can check out, I think it's called The Christian Hypocrisy of In God We Trust. It's an article I wrote a while back on Free Thought Now.
Right. I mean, leaving aside sort of that it's a legal fiction and how sort of undermining it is to the constitutional principles of secular government, I think also it's just super insulting to true believers and people who really revere, you know, the what in God we trust is supposed to express or mean in their, you know, personal religious
and there were briefs to that point in the cross case where they were saying, look, you can't call the cross secular. It's our most sacred symbol.
Right.
For a court to declare that it is secular is for a court to denigrate our religion, which makes a lot of sense. And it's one of the reasons the founders chose to separate state and church. James Madison said that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they're mixed together. And this was one of the things he was kind of talking about.
All right. This one is from Karen Craig Walker. Why do so many courthouses still have the Ten Commandments hanging in the halls? So, I mean, maybe not directly on point with your book, but of course, a large part of your book uses the Ten Commandments, like you said in the interview, sort of uses the Ten Commandments to illustrate how Christian holy laws are fundamentally opposed to American values. So, what do you think? What do you make of sort of our political obsession with the Ten Commandments?
Well, and that's one of the things that the book is trying to address. It's trying to show that, look, we have, as a culture and a society, accepted the idea that the Ten Commandments were heavily influential in American law and government, and nothing could be further from the truth. It simply does not withstand scrutiny. I mean, first you have to answer, which Ten Commandments are we talking about? Are we talking about Exodus 20 or Exodus 34 or Deuteronomy 5 or Deuteronomy 27? And then you have to get into the actual content of the commandments themselves. I mean, if you read the full commandment, which is actually an interesting point because none of the monuments show the full language of the commandments. They're edited by human beings to make them more moral. So for instance, edited out of all the commandment monuments you see is the promise that God makes to punish children to the third and fourth generation of people who break their oaths and take the Lord's name in vain, things like that. We see punishing innocent people, we see thought crime, we see the subjugation of women, slavery is implicitly recognized in the Ten Commandments twice. They're not even a moral guide, let alone a good legal guide. So it's a mystery why they're up on these courthouses, but one of the things that this book is hoping to push back on.
So there was a question on here that I've lost, but let me ask this one. This might be our last question. I think it's a little antagonistic. Some critics of the Bible find archaeology and history compelling, even the eyewitness testimonies credible. This is from Colleen Love. If this book is supernaturally written and passed down over the centuries, isn't it dangerous to be judging God?
Yeah, I don't quite get what Colleen is going for there. But one of the big argument that the book makes is it's pushing back against the claim that we're founded on Judeo-Christian principles, which if you try to figure out what a Judeo-Christian principle is, if you ask a Christian nationalist, what do you mean by that? they never really answer.
Right. I've heard sort of biblically inspired.
They dance around it, and they always end up coming back to the Bible. So basically they're saying, yeah, look at the Bible, that shows the Judeo-Christian principles. And the Bible is a really bad book. It's not well written, it's not coherent, it's full of genocide and rape and torture. I mean, hell in the New Testament, as we discussed on the show. It is not a book that you would want to base a nation on. And if you're looking for governments in the Bible, the only thing that's in there are monarchies, not anything close to a representative democracy.
Right.
So whether or not it is divinely inspired, it's not a good book, and it's certainly not a guide for founding a country or formulating laws.
Right. So from Melissa Alexander, this says, do you touch on the influence of the Enlightenment on the Founding Fathers intellectually and politically, and how these dynamics and narratives from France and other parts of Europe are much more behind the ideologies espoused in the founding of the United States? So I think that's a little bit of a wordy way of saying, do you touch in your book on what the actual influence on the Founding Fathers' political ideology was?
Yes, if it wasn't religion, what was it? And the answer is almost certainly the Enlightenment. A great example of this is the separation of powers. One of the things that's central, is built into the very fabric of the Constitution, is the idea that we're going to separate power to dilute it and basically use that as a method to prevent tyranny. If you listen to the Christian nationalists, they'll actually tell you that that idea came from the Holy Trinity, or from a chapter in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, and that's fundamentally not true. The founders told us where they got that idea from. They got it from Montesquieu. They got it from the Enlightenment, and that's just one illustration of the broader point. I do touch on the founders in a couple of the chapters in the book, and one thing that I think it's important to note is that I don't really think their religious beliefs or lack of religious beliefs matter to the central question of, did they found a Christian nation,
right,
or did they base it on Judeo-Christian principles? The central thing is that they chose to separate state and church. They chose to keep religion and government in different spheres, and that's the key point.
Right, that's right. Well, that was our final question. So as we said earlier, The Founding Myth, Andrew's book, will be out in bookstores on May 14th. But you can pre-order it at any of your friendly neighborhood booksellers, including here at the FFRF online store at ffrf.org/shop. We'd like to encourage you to help FFRF by exposing government officials who violate the law. So if you want to receive FFRF action alerts on your smartphone, text FFRF to 52886. Data rates may apply. Again, that's FFRF to 52886. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next week for another edition of Ask an Atheist.